James Carter sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the rain streaking down the window. The rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the glass was the only sound accompanying the storm raging within him. Just months ago, he had been on the fast track to success, a rising star in one of the most prestigious business firms in the city. He had worked tirelessly, proving his worth through late nights, flawless reports, and strategic insights that had saved the company millions. Yet, despite his dedication, his career had come crashing down in the blink of an eye, leaving him with nothing but a bitter taste of injustice. The betrayal had been swift and merciless. One of his colleagues, Ryan Foster, had been wrongfully accused of embezzlement, a convenient scapegoat for a crime committed by someone far more powerful. James had seen the truth buried beneath the lies. He had gathered undeniable evidence that proved Ryan's innocence and pointed to a senior executive as the real culprit. When the time came to speak up, he had done so without hesitation, believing that truth and integrity would prevail. But the corporate world didn't operate on fairness. It thrived on power plays and silent complicity. The moment James presented his evidence, the atmosphere in the conference room had turned cold. His boss, Richard Donovan, had stared him down with an expression that was equal parts amusement and menace. "You think you can change the rules, Carter?" he had scoffed, slamming a hand on the polished mahogany table. "You're just another replaceable employee. And employees who don't know their place don't last long here." True to his words, James had been systematically destroyed from that moment on. His workload doubled overnight, with impossible deadlines and unrealistic expectations set solely to watch him fail. Every report he submitted was scrutinized and unfairly criticized. Performance reviews that once praised his skills turned into pages of fabricated incompetence. Colleagues who once admired him now avoided eye contact, unwilling to associate with a man marked for professional exile. Then came the final blow, a termination letter casually tossed onto his desk one Friday afternoon. "We don't need a troublemaker in this company," Richard had said, his smirk infuriatingly smug. James had clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he had swallowed his rage. There was no use fighting anymore. The decision had been made long before he walked into that meeting with the truth. In the weeks that followed, James tried to rebuild. He polished his resume, applied for jobs, reached out to connections, only to realize that his reputation had been tainted beyond repair. Doors that were once open to him slammed shut the moment they heard his name. The industry was small, and Richard Donovan's influence reached far. Every rejection felt like another punch to the gut, each one a reminder that doing the right thing had cost him everything. Now, as he sat in his tiny rented home, a far cry from the sleek city apartment he had once owned, James felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had always believed in hard work, in justice, in the idea that good people could change the world. But the world had proven him wrong. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The rain outside was relentless, much like his thoughts. Where did he go from here? What was left for a man who had lost not only his job but his belief in the system he had once trusted? Little did he know, fate was about to intervene. And everything he thought he had lost was merely the beginning of something far greater. The rain was relentless, pouring down in thick sheets, drumming against the rooftops and pooling in the cracks of the worn-out pavement. It was the kind of storm that made the world feel smaller, isolating everything in a haze of water and darkness. James Carter sat motionless on his couch, one arm draped over the backrest, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The dim light flickered, casting uneven shadows across the walls of his small, rented home. His thoughts were heavier than the storm outside, drenched in frustration, burdened by the weight of countless unanswered job applications and an uncertain future. Then, BM! A violent crash ripped through the silence. James bolted upright, his senses snapping into sharp focus. He turned toward the window, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Outside, through the distorted veil of rain, a pair of headlights flickered weakly at the edge of the road. He rushed to the door, flung it open, and stepped out into the storm. Cold raindrops lashed against his skin as he sprinted forward, his shoes sinking slightly into the waterlogged ground. A sleek black luxury car had veered off the slippery road, its front wheels buried deep in a muddy ditch. The windshield wipers moved sluggishly, struggling against the downpour. Steam curled from under the hood, mixing with the misty air. Whoever was inside hadn't moved. James knocked sharply on the rain-streaked window. "Hey! Are you all right?" His voice barely carried over the roaring wind. A moment of tense silence followed before the door finally clicked open. A woman stepped out. She moved with a certain calculated grace, despite the circumstances. The dim streetlight illuminated her face, sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, lips pressed into a firm, unyielding line. Her dark hair, damp from the rain, clung to her temples, and though her fitted blazer was now wrinkled and damp, it still exuded an air of power. She couldn't have been older than her early 40s, yet she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to control. James hesitated. He had expected panic, fear, or at least frustration. But she showed none of those things. Instead, her gaze flicked to him, assessing him swiftly before shifting to the car. "I need help," she said simply, her voice low yet commanding. There was no desperation, no pleading, just a statement of fact, as if she expected assistance without question. James pushed back his curiosity and crouched near the car, running his fingers along the edge of the stuck tire. The mud had swallowed it completely. With the weight of the car and the angle it had landed in, there was no way she could drive it out on her own. "You're not getting this out without a tow truck," he said, standing up. "And with this storm, it might take hours before anyone even picks up the call." The woman exhaled sharply and pulled out her phone. She pressed the power button once, twice, nothing. No signal. James caught the way her jaw tensed for a fraction of a second before she schooled her features back into neutrality. "There's a guest house about 2 miles from here," James suggested, though he already knew it was unlikely to be open at this hour. When she didn't respond, he hesitated before adding, "Or, you could stay at my place for the night. It's just over there." He jerked his thumb toward the small house behind him. "It's not much, but at least it's dry." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the desolate road stretching behind them, the heavy downpour blurring the view ahead. Something about her demeanor told him she wasn't used to relying on strangers, let alone accepting their kindness. She probably wasn't the type of person who ended up in situations she couldn't control. And yet, here she was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no other viable options. Finally, she gave a slow, measured nod. "All right," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone granting permission rather than accepting help. "Lead the way." As they walked toward the house, James stole a quick glance at her. There was something undeniably different about this woman, something beyond her expensive car and the quiet confidence she carried. She didn't belong here, that much was obvious. People like her belonged in high-rise offices, not standing in the rain on the outskirts of a forgotten town. He had no idea who she was, but instinct told him this was no ordinary encounter. Inside the house, the warm air was a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. James switched on the light, revealing the small but neat living space, an old couch, a wooden coffee table covered with scattered papers, and a bookshelf stacked with books on business, leadership, and strategy. The woman, now visibly more relaxed but still composed, glanced around, taking everything in with a silent curiosity. James grabbed a towel from a nearby chair and handed it to her. "Here," he said. "It's not fresh, but it's dry." She took it without a word, dabbing the rain from her face and hair before carefully removing her soaked blazer. Underneath, she wore a tailored white blouse, now slightly wrinkled from the rain, but still crisp enough to suggest she had started the day looking impeccable. James moved toward the kitchen. "I'll make some tea. It'll help with the cold." As he set the kettle on the stove, he couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here. Women like her didn't just end up on deserted roads in the middle of a storm. There was a reason she was here, a story behind the accident. He had a feeling it was something important. And soon, he would find out. Victoria Hamilton sat stiffly on the worn-out couch, her sharp eyes scanning the modest surroundings. The house was small, nothing like the grand hotels or luxury apartments she was accustomed to, but it was neat and organized. The scent of old books and freshly brewed tea filled the air, mingling with the distant sound of raindrops tapping against the window. The dim yellow light overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. James Carter moved through the small kitchen with ease, pouring hot water into 2 ceramic mugs. His posture was relaxed, but Victoria could tell he was aware of her presence, just as she was aware of his. There was something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed, purposeful, yet guarded. He wasn't the type to offer help easily, but he had done so without hesitation tonight. That intrigued her. As James set a steaming mug of tea in front of her, he finally spoke. "You should drink this. It'll warm you up." Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking up the mug. The warmth spread through her fingertips, momentarily distracting her from the cold that had seeped into her bones. She took a small sip, letting the heat soothe her throat. It had been a long, exhausting day, one that had ended in a way she hadn't foreseen. James sat across from her, his gaze steady but unreadable. He didn't ask questions, which surprised her. Most people, when faced with someone like her, a woman dressed in power, exuding control, would have immediately pried into her business. Who was she? Where was she going? Why was she alone? But James remained silent, observing rather than interrogating. After a moment, she finally broke the silence. "You live here alone?" James nodded, leaning back slightly. "For now." "For now?" He let out a small, almost bitter chuckle. "Let's just say I didn't plan on being here either." Something about the way he said it caught her attention. There was history in his voice, something unspoken lingering beneath the surface. Victoria had spent years mastering the art of reading people. It was a skill that had served her well in the cutthroat world of business. And right now, she could tell that James Carter was a man standing at the edge of something. Whether it was failure, reinvention, or complete collapse, she wasn't sure. She placed her cup down, her gaze unwavering. "You don't seem like the type who belongs in a place like this." James raised an eyebrow. "Neither do you." A small smirk played at the corner of her lips. "Fair enough." For a moment, the tension in the room softened. The storm outside had settled into a steady drizzle, and in its place, an odd quiet had fallen between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken curiosity. They were strangers, yet there was an undeniable understanding between them. Two people who had, for different reasons, found themselves in unfamiliar places. Victoria finally glanced at the bookshelf behind him, her eyes skimming over the titles. Business strategy, leadership, economics, philosophy. She reached for one, running a finger along the worn spine. "You read a lot." James shrugged. "Gotta do something with my time." She turned the book over in her hands before looking at him again. "A man who's out of work but still reading about leadership and business? That's unusual." James's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice neutral. "I used to be in the corporate world. Until I wasn't." Victoria studied him for a moment. She could see the remnants of that world still clinging to him, the sharpness in his eyes, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. He wasn't lost. He was simply waiting. She took another sip of tea, then leaned back, crossing her legs. "So, what happened?" James exhaled slowly, staring into his cup. For some reason, he didn't feel the usual resistance when talking about his past. Maybe it was because she wasn't prying out of idle curiosity. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long while, he was sitting across from someone who seemed to understand what it meant to lose something. "I worked for a major firm in the city," he said, his voice even. "Climbed the ladder, earned my place. Then one day, a colleague of mine was accused of something he didn't do. I had proof that it was someone higher up, one of the executives. I spoke up." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "That was my mistake." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "They turned on you." James met her gaze. "Completely." For the first time that evening, a flicker of something passed through Victoria's expression, something almost resembling approval. She had met countless men in her industry, but few had the courage to challenge power when it mattered. Most would have looked the other way, played the game, protected themselves. James had chosen otherwise. He noticed the way she was watching him now, not with pity, but with something sharper. "I don't regret it," he added after a pause. "I just didn't expect it to cost me everything." Victoria placed her cup down, the faintest smile curling at the corner of her lips. "That's because you assumed the game was fair." James let out a breath. "And you don't?" She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I learned a long time ago that fairness is a luxury for people who can afford to lose." Silence fell between them again, but this time, it felt different. There was no awkwardness, only a strange, unspoken understanding. Two people from different worlds, yet somehow standing on the same ground. James studied her for a moment before finally asking, "What about you? What's a woman like you doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" Victoria's fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic mug. "Let's just say I didn't plan on being here either." He smirked slightly at her borrowed words, but his curiosity remained. There was more to her story, he could sense it. But he also knew she wasn't the type to reveal it easily. Whatever had brought her here, whatever circumstances had led to this unexpected meeting, James had a feeling that neither of them would be walking away from this night unchanged. And he was right. The storm outside had quieted into a soft drizzle, but inside the small house, another kind of storm brewed, one of curiosity, unspoken questions, and careful observations. Victoria Hamilton couldn't sleep. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, controlling her time, her emotions, her surroundings. Yet tonight she found herself in an unfamiliar space, both physically and mentally. The creaking wooden walls, the faint scent of old books and black coffee, the dim yellow light leaking through the cracks in the door, it was all so different from the luxurious, sterile environments she was used to. And it unsettled her. She had tried. She had laid down on the modest bed James had so easily given up for her, letting the exhaustion of the day settle over her. But her mind refused to rest. It wasn't just the strangeness of the place. It was him. James Carter. Something about him nagged at her. He was unlike the men she had encountered in her world, men who either groveled at her feet, desperate for favor, or who challenged her out of arrogance, eager to prove they could stand toe-to-toe with her. James was neither. He had helped her without hesitation but had asked for nothing in return. He had observed her, measured her, but not once had he attempted to impress her or seek validation. He wasn't intimidated, nor was he opportunistic. That made him interesting. And Victoria Hamilton did not ignore interesting people. Unable to silence her thoughts, she sat up, running a hand through her slightly damp hair. The room was still, the quiet hum of the night pressing in around her. A glance at the clock on the wall told her it was well past midnight. Yet beyond the door, faint lights still flickered. She pushed the blanket aside and stood, padding softly toward the door. When she stepped into the living room, she wasn't surprised to find James still awake. He was seated on the couch, one leg propped up on the coffee table, a book resting in his lap. The dim glow of the reading lamp cast long shadows over his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his eyes as they moved across the page. There was an ease to the way he sat, but not relaxation. No, there was something restless about it, like a man waiting for something, even if he wasn't sure what. Victoria didn't speak immediately. She simply watched him. James, sensing her presence, glanced up. His gaze flickered with mild surprise but not discomfort. He closed the book and set it aside, giving her his full attention. "You're still awake," she noted, her voice softer than usual. James leaned back slightly, one arm resting on the armrest. "So are you," she exhaled, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorway. "Old habits," she admitted. "I don't sleep much." James smirked faintly. "People in power rarely do." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And what would you know about that?" James tilted his head slightly, as if debating whether or not to answer. Then, in a low, casual voice, he said, I worked in corporate long enough to recognize the signs. Victoria's lips curled slightly at the edges, impressed but not surprised. She had suspected as much. He had the sharpness of someone who had played the game, the weary but determined look of a man who had fought for his place and lost it. She took a step forward, finally moving to sit in the chair across from him. And yet here you are, she said, gesturing around the small, unassuming space. Reading books about leadership while sitting in a house that doesn't quite fit the image of a man who once climbed the corporate ladder. James chuckled, low and amused. I guess you could say I had a fall from grace. Victoria studied him. Or maybe the world just showed you how it really works. James didn't answer right away. He simply held her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. There was no bitterness there, just understanding, as if he had already accepted the cruel truths she was speaking of. She reached over, picking up the book he had set aside. Business Strategy and the Art of Leadership. Her eyebrow arched slightly. You still care about this world? James exhaled through his nose, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't just stop caring about something because it threw you away. Victoria turned the book over in her hands. So what's your plan? James hesitated, then let out a quiet, almost self-deprecating laugh. Plan? He shook his head. Right now, I'm just surviving. She tapped her fingers against the book's cover, thoughtful. Survival isn't enough. James looked at her, intrigued. And what do you suggest? Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed the book back on the table and met his gaze with something new in her expression, something calculative. Find a way back in, she said smoothly. But this time, on your own terms. James narrowed his eyes slightly. You say that like it's easy. It's not. She smirked. But neither is sitting in this house waiting for an opportunity that may never come. James studied her, weighing her words. He knew there was more to this conversation than just idle advice. There was something about the way she spoke, as if she already had something in mind. He leaned back slightly. You sound like someone who's offering something. Victoria tilted her head, her smirk widening just a fraction. Perhaps. The rain outside had stopped completely now, leaving only silence in its wake. The two of them sat there, locked in quiet contemplation, either breaking eye contact. In that moment, James realized something. This woman, Victoria Hamilton, wasn't just another stranger passing through his life. She was something more. A force. A catalyst. And whatever she had in mind for him, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same after tonight. The silence between them stretched, thick with something unspoken yet undeniable. Victoria Hamilton leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. The dim lighting cast sharp shadows over her face, accentuating the quiet confidence she wore like a second skin. Across from her, James Carter sat with his arms loosely resting on his knees, watching her with a mix of curiosity and caution. James had met many powerful people before, executives, CEOs, decision-makers who held the fate of employees in the palms of their hands. But none had intrigued him quite like Victoria. She wasn't just powerful. She was calculated. Every word, every glance, every pause in their conversation was deliberate. And right now, she was studying him as much as he was studying her. She finally broke the silence. Tell me something, James. Her voice was smooth, measured. If you could go back, if you had another chance to step into the corporate world, but this time with more power, more control, would you take it? James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. That depends, he said, tilting his head slightly. On what exactly you're offering. Victoria smirked, a hint of amusement flashing in her eyes. She liked that he wasn't quick to jump at an opportunity without understanding the full picture. That told her he wasn't just desperate, he was careful. And careful men were valuable. She reached for her cup of tea, taking a slow sip before setting it down. I don't believe in coincidences, James, she said finally. Tonight I ended up here, not in a five-star hotel, not in a high-rise suite, but in your house, in front of you. And you? You're a man who once had power, who understands the game, but who was cast aside because you refused to play dirty. She tapped her fingers against the ceramic mug. I don't think that was a mistake. James frowned slightly, watching her intently. You think this is fate? Victoria let out a soft chuckle. I think this is an opportunity. James studied her carefully, weighing her words. There was something dangerously compelling about the way she spoke, like a strategist setting the board before revealing her winning move. Then, she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to command his full attention. I want you to work for me. James blinked once. He had expected something big, but not this. He kept his expression neutral, but his pulse quickened slightly. You don't even know me, he said carefully. Victoria arched a perfectly sculpted brow. I know enough. James let out a slow breath, rubbing his jaw. Why me? Victoria's smirk deepened. Because you're exactly what I need, someone who isn't tied to any faction, who doesn't owe loyalty to anyone. Someone smart enough to understand the game but disillusioned enough to want to change it. She held his gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable. You have no attachments, no obligations. You've already lost everything once, which means you have nothing left to fear. James felt his chest tighten at those words. It was the brutal truth, laid out in a way he hadn't quite admitted to himself before. He had spent the last few months trying to claw his way back into a system that had discarded him. But what if he had been looking at it all wrong? What if the way back wasn't through the front door, but through a different path entirely? He exhaled sharply. And what exactly would I be doing for you? Victoria leaned back again, crossing her arms. That depends on how ambitious you are. James huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. That sounds a lot like a test. Everything is a test, she replied smoothly. The question is, are you ready to take it? James ran a hand through his hair, looking away for a moment. This was insane. A day ago, he was just another washed-up corporate outcast with no prospects. And now, sitting across from one of the most powerful women he had ever met, he was being offered a chance at something entirely new. He turned back to her, his expression serious. And if I say no? Victoria's lips curled into something between a smirk and a challenge. Then you go back to your life here, reading books about business instead of being in it. She let the words settle before adding. But somehow, I don't think that's what you really want. James let out a slow breath. Damn her, she was right. He locked eyes with her, and for the first time that night, he made a decision. I'm in. Victoria's smirk deepened slightly. She had known his answer before he even said it. Good, she said simply. Then she stood, brushing non-existent wrinkles from her blouse. Get some rest, James. We leave for the city at sunrise. James watched as she turned and walked toward the room he had given her, her movements confident, assured, like a queen who had just recruited her newest knight. As the door clicked shut behind her, James leaned back into the couch, staring at the ceiling. His life had just changed forever. James Carter sat motionless on the couch long after Victoria Hamilton had disappeared into the guest room. The air in the small house still carried the weight of her words, pressing down on him like an unseen force. We leave for the city at sunrise. It wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration. A summons. A door swinging open to a world he thought had shut him out for good. James leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely clasped. His mind raced. Work for her? He still didn't fully understand what that meant. Victoria Hamilton was no ordinary corporate player. She was a woman who moved with purpose, who didn't believe in luck or chance. If she had chosen him, it wasn't out of kindness. It was because she saw something in him that could be of use to her. The question was, what did she see? And more importantly, was he ready to step back into that world? The corporate world had chewed him up and spit him out without hesitation. He had learned the hard way that justice didn't matter, that truth wasn't enough to save you. If he went back, it wouldn't be as the same man who had walked into that boardroom months ago, foolishly believing that exposing corruption would lead to change. No. If he was going back, it would be different this time. This time, he wouldn't just be another piece on the board. This time, he would learn to play the game on his own terms. James let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He should sleep. Tomorrow, no, today, was already here. In just a few hours, he would be walking away from this house, leaving behind the months of stagnation and frustration. But as he stared at the ceiling, his mind refused to settle. Instead, he found himself thinking about Victoria. The woman was an enigma. He had met powerful people before, but none quite like her. Most corporate executives thrived on intimidation, using arrogance and wealth as weapons. But Victoria didn't need to demand respect, she commanded it effortlessly. Every move, every word, was measured, controlled. And yet, beneath that sharp exterior, he could sense something else. A purpose. She hadn't told him why she was here, why she had been driving alone in the middle of the night, miles away from where someone like her should have been. But James knew one thing: Victoria Hamilton never did anything without reason. And now, he was part of that reason. The morning after, a new beginning. James didn't remember when he had finally drifted off, but the sound of movement in the other room pulled him back to consciousness. The world outside was still dim, the sky painted in early morning hues of blue and gray. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air crisp with the scent of wet earth. The door to the guest room opened, and Victoria emerged, dressed impeccably despite the simplicity of her attire. A fitted black blazer, dark trousers, and an expensive watch that gleamed under the soft light. Composed. Ready. Unshaken. James exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his tousled hair before pushing himself up from the couch. "You're up early." Victoria smirked slightly, reaching for her phone, which was now picking up a signal. "I don't waste time." James stretched his arms before glancing toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" She gave a small nod. "Black." Of course. He could have guessed that. As James moved around the small kitchen, preparing the coffee, he felt the reality of the situation begin to settle. This was it. He had spent months drifting, weighed down by the anger and betrayal of what had been done to him. But today, everything changed. When he handed her the cup, Victoria took a slow sip before setting it down on the counter. Then, she reached into her blazer and pulled out a sleek black envelope, placing it between them. James raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Your contract," she said simply. James wiped his hands on a dish towel before picking it up. He flipped it open, scanning the first few lines. His pulse quickened. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a position of power. Executive level. A 6-figure salary to start, plus incentives. Direct access to Hamilton and Company's top board members. An entrance into a world most people spent decades trying to reach. He looked up at her. "This isn't just some assistant role." Victoria's smirk deepened. "I told you, James. I don't hire people to follow orders. I hire people who can help me build something greater." James closed the envelope, tapping his fingers against it thoughtfully. "And what exactly are we building?" Victoria leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "A new kind of power. One that doesn't play by the old rules." James's stomach tightened slightly, not out of fear, but out of something else. Anticipation. He could walk away now. Turn back, stay in this small house, continue searching for opportunities that would never come. Or he could take this chance. Step into a world where power wasn't just given, it was taken. Victoria watched him carefully, as if she already knew his answer. James exhaled slowly. Then, with a steady hand, he picked up a pen and signed his name. Victoria nodded, satisfied. "Good," she murmured. "Now pack your things. We have a flight to catch." James looked around the small house one last time. The walls that had held his frustration, the books that had been his only companions during the long nights, the empty silence that had haunted him since his downfall. Then, without hesitation, he turned away and followed Victoria out the door. The car was waiting. And with it, a new life. The black luxury car cut through the misty morning, gliding smoothly along the damp highway. James Carter sat in the passenger seat, watching the blurred countryside fade into towering skyscrapers in the distance. The further they drove, the more it became clear he was leaving his old life behind. Victoria Hamilton sat beside him, calm and composed, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She drove with the same precision she carried in everything she did, controlled, focused, unshaken. She hadn't spoken much since they left, and neither had James. There was no need. The weight of his decision still lingered in the air between them. James glanced at her from the corner of his eye. He still didn't fully understand why she had chosen him, why she had sought him out specifically. But he knew one thing: Victoria Hamilton didn't make mistakes. If she had pulled him from the ruins of his past, it was because she had a plan. And now, he was part of it. The city skyline loomed closer, a stark contrast to the quiet roads they had left behind. Glass towers stretched toward the sky, reflecting the golden hues of the early morning sun. The air smelled of ambition, of deals being made, of fortunes being built and destroyed in the span of a single meeting. As they entered the heart of the financial district, Victoria finally spoke. "Welcome back, James." James smirked slightly, his fingers drumming against his knee. "I wasn't sure I'd ever return." Victoria glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the road. "That was your mistake." James raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She shifted gears effortlessly, weaving through the morning traffic. "You let them throw you out. You let them dictate your worth. You let yourself believe that one loss meant the game was over." James let out a quiet breath, looking out the window. "And what about you?" he asked. "You don't strike me as someone who lets others dictate anything." Victoria chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Because I learned early that power isn't given. It's taken." James considered her words, letting them settle. He had spent months fighting against his own irrelevance, trying to reclaim something that had been stolen from him. But maybe Victoria was right. Maybe he had been playing the wrong game all along. The car slowed as they pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a towering skyscraper. The entrance was sleek, guarded, and unmistakably exclusive. This wasn't just any building, this was power. Victoria parked and stepped out without hesitation. James followed, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. The elevator doors slid open as they approached, and Victoria pressed the keycard against the panel. The light blinked green, and the doors glided shut behind them. As the elevator began its smooth ascent, Victoria turned to him. "You're about to enter a world most people only dream of," she said. "It's ruthless, it's unforgiving, and it doesn't reward weakness." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you ready for that?" James met her gaze, a slow smirk tugging at his lips. For the first time in months, he felt alive. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Victoria studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good." The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. And just like that, James Carter stepped into a new life.